I'm going to go ahead now and introduce our main guest. And as I said before, we had Mr. Hopkins came here earlier during the week. He went up to Sacramento, spoke up at Ashland, Oregon, came down to, let's see, that was Tuesday, right, Bud? Yeah. Then came down from Tuesday, him and Leslie drove from there on back to Union City Borders Bookstore, and he gave a presentation there. And then he spoke on Friday at the, I forgot the name of the bookstore, but in San Rafael. What was the name of it, Bud? It was a Metaphysical Bookstore there. And then yesterday he spoke at the Sacramento MUFON group up there, and now we have him here. And then tomorrow you fly off back to New York. So we've kept them very busy. Bud Hopkins pioneered the first systematic research into reports of human abductions by UFO occupants. Over the past 25 years, he has worked with hundreds of abduction experiencers in the United States and abroad, uncovering many recurring patterns of abductions, activity, and through effectively initiating modern abduction research. Throughout the years, Hopkins' goal has been to bring an objective, dispassionate, scientific intelligence to bear on this phenomena, and he has systematically collected data on the physical evidence in pursuit, and he has systematically, as I mentioned before, worked on collecting physical evidence. In pursuit of this goal, he's founded the Intruders Foundation, and he has, I don't know if you brought any more of the newsletters, but I have one here. And in 1899, it's a not-for-profit organization devoted to research and public education concerning this extraordinary enigma. Hopkins is the author of Missing Time, which was my first book that I read from Bud, and to be followed by Intruders, the incredible visitation at Copley Woods, and that was written back in 1987, which was a New York Times bestseller and the basis for a 1992 CBS miniseries, and witnessed the true story of the Brooklyn Bridge UFO abduction. His latest book, Sight Unseen, co-written with his wife, Carol Rainey, was just released last fall by Adrian Simon and Schuster. In fact, we have a couple books back there that are still left, so be sure you buy your copy. And then after the presentation, Bud will do some signing. And I believe we have a limited amount of books. Is that correct, Leslie? How many more do we have? 7? Oh, folks, sorry, but you have to rush up there and get them, and if not, Bud will have to work arrangements to get more books, okay? Again, he has lectured throughout the world and is an acclaimed artist, and he also has, when we'll be taking a break, he has an outstanding collection of collages there, and so if you're interested in buying any, please see Bud on that. And again, he does work in Union City. No, in New York City. We had you in Union City there. It was the aliens that broke into my car. We caught them. Anyway, unfortunately, that's what happened. There was a couple of vandalisms, and then when we were coming back to my car, it was broken into. And I thought, oh, don't let this bum me out, because it's been a great week other than that little item there. But anyway, today's focus, the lecture, will provide the latest physical evidence for the abduction phenomena, including ground traces and marks on people illustrated with slides. But will also present a number of new cases that he has not talked about before. One involves a teenager in England who was taken from one house and returned to a different house in a strange bedroom miles away, naked, in the middle of a cold night. The audience will hear part of a tape regression with him. He's now a grown man. Okay, and that wasn't me. No. Another case includes video footage of a UFO, which we have in upstate New York, shot just before the photographer, a former corrections officer, reports being taken. And from the book, Sight Unseen, Bud will present a case of UFO invisibility, illustrated with photographs taken at the scene. As a special feature, Bud will also talk about a case he investigated of a UFO crash with bodies which took part in 1966 in New Mexico. He will show a short video about this case, which includes interviews with highly credible witnesses and a visit to the remote hospital where the bodies were taken. After his presentation, we'll follow when you want to take a break, Bud. Normally our breaks are about 10 to 15 minutes, and then after that we'll have a Q&A session. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bud Hopkins.
Well, I want to thank everybody while I'm getting dressed back here for coming, and for Les and the Opus Group, and certainly for my new friend, really. Ruben and I have gotten to be very friendly over the past few days, and it's been a terrific time here. And I want to thank my friend Leslie Kane, who has been chauffeuring me around and arranged much of this, and has been wonderful helping. But before I start, I just something popped into my mind. It's probably not the most proper thing in the world, but Eric von Däniken was mentioned. And I was speaking at a conference in Istanbul a number of years ago, and Eric von Däniken was there, and we were having a kind of a formal dinner. It was very, very nice. First time I really had a chance to sit down and talk to him. Now, for those of you who know him, he's very serious, very intense, and I wouldn't say that he's as loaded with humor as some people are in the world. He's Swiss, after all, and there's a kind of seriousness of that. But sometimes when I feel someone is not quite loaded with humor, it's terrible. I'm drawn to it, the moth to the flame. And he had shown a number of slides, extremely beautiful, the Nazca lines at this conference. And, you know, they become a serpent here and a bird there, whatever. These really quite amazing things seen from a great altitude. And so during the banquet, I said, you know, Eric, I saw something in one of those photographs of Nazca lines that I guess you missed. And of course, he got really nervous about that. And he said, what was that? And I said, well, the one with the serpent. I said, down in the lower right-hand corner, there was a perfect linear representation of Richard Hoagland's face. And he didn't like that. I thought it was immensely funny, but that was my own personal taste, I guess. At any rate, what I'm going to do is, I'm afraid we're not going to probably have time for the tape of the this crash retrieval case. It's a very good case. We'll have to present it some other time. But I think we're going to focus on the abduction phenomenon. And before I start, I want to show you some very interesting things. I think I just want to review very quickly how I got involved in this. For those of you who might not be familiar, many of you probably are. But I have been a professional artist all my life and was a total skeptic with regard to the subject and no interest. And I had a UFO daylight sighting back in 1964, 2 other people. And it was a run-of-the-mill sighting as that goes, except it was daytime and you could see the craft very clearly. It hovered, it flew away. And that got my attention. I began reading about it. And, you know, I watched anything on television that turned up. I remember hissing myself in my room, hissing Alan Hynek for the, of course, the famous swamp gas theory and so on. That was all after my sighting. But I did nothing about it. I wasn't investigating. But then in 1975 is when I began. And I should point out that when I had the sighting in '64, of course, really nobody knew anything about abductions at all. And in '66, 2 years later, when the Betty and Barney Hill case came to light, I just rejected it. I just thought it ridiculous. And I rejected it because it just seemed too much to accept. And the interesting thing about these very, very serious people who were investigating UFO sightings in those years, the NICAP group and MUFON and APRO. APRO was a little more liberal about it, but certainly NICAP. The idea was that a UFO was some kind of equipment, and the whole idea was to get a picture or whatever of the object itself. And no one could accept the idea that there was an occupant. That's just a little too much. Now, when you think about it, it's completely illogical to think that the thing can be flying around. But as David Jacobs said, it took the UFO researchers 20 years to accept the idea that a UFO had an inside. And I've always put it this way, that it took us all that time that we spent trying to get the license plate number on the getaway car without having figured out what the crime was. And it has to do with human nature. We want it to be out there somewhere. Out there is fine. And I think you probably noticed that every time you get a photograph of something out there, a UFO photograph, you'll say, oh, that's a good, very good photograph. Gets closer, more detail, must be a fake. Anything that gets close enough to show detail, we get really upset about and we back away from, because in a way it's getting a little too close. Well, when the Betty and Barney Hill case came up, as I said, it was, to me, just, it was far too close. And so I couldn't accept it. It took me a couple of years before I realized I had no reason to not accept it. These people were terrific people and so forth. But by 1975, when I really began investigating, we thought that maybe those researchers who were serious about looking into this thought that maybe there were 8 or 10 or 12 abductions. That was it. It was extremely rare. And to show you how we thought about it, even back in the earlier years in the 60s and so on in NICAP, if somebody reported 2 UFO sightings, it was dumped because it was regarded as so rare that if somebody saw something twice, they must be making it up. And this, you know, we have been an extremely conservative group, actually, over the years. And the data keeps forcing its way into our attention, and we're kind of stuck with it. And this has been the story of my life, actually. But at any rate, in 1975, I was accepting the cases that I read about, Pascagoula in '73, Hickson Parker, Travis Walton, the well-known ones, Shermer, there were a number of others. But at any rate, in 1975, the man across the street from me had a store, which I patronized, and I will admit it was a liquor store, you know, but I just went to cash checks. I never actually bought anything. But at any rate, he told me one night, very, very disturbed, the man could be driving home and something could come down out of the sky and land next to your car and scare you half to death, and little people get out. And I said, what are you telling me, George? At any rate, he told, the whole story unfolded, and this was one terrified man. He's telling me the story many months after it happened. But he said, when this thing landed in a park directly across the Hudson River from Manhattan, this was literally 1 mile from Broadway. You know, the story is it's always some guy in the back of a pickup truck in Kansas sees this. No, this was 1 mile from Broadway in New Jersey. He said that when he went home, and there didn't seem to be an abduction or time problem. When he went home, he said he was so afraid when he went in his apartment, he didn't even turn the light on. He didn't want anybody out there to know where he lived. And he said, here I am 70 years old, and I pulled the covers over my head, and I couldn't sleep. Well, anyway, I looked into this case, and I began knocking on doors, and I found the second witness. It was a doorman, a night doorman at another building. And you're not going to believe this, but the building where this doorman witnessed the whole thing was a round building, and it was called the Stonehenge. It sounds like a setup or something, but there it was. At any rate, I subsequently found other witnesses, and I published an article about it in the Village Voice, which was later reprinted in Cosmopolitan magazine. And I don't think I look like a Cosmo writer, but who knows what they look like. But at any rate, I started getting letters from people. This is how I got into the abduction phenomenon, because I wasn't looking for this. But the letters were people writing me and calling and saying that something similar happened to them that happened to this man at the liquor store, except that we didn't see the object leave. It was right above our car, our engine stopped, and it was just gone. And we got home really late, et cetera, et cetera. So subsequently, I began looking into these cases, and I had some friends who were psychiatrists and psychologists who I got to do hypnosis for me with some of these cases of missing time. I was trading them works of art for their time, and suddenly I'm into a lot of cases. And in some of the cases, we discovered that the person had never seen a UFO. Now, if you remember, Hickson Parker, Pascagoula case, Betty Barney Hill, Travis Walton, everyone remembered consciously seeing the UFO or seeing aliens. There was a lot of conscious memory. But I began finding cases with no conscious memory. Man just had a certain terror of a certain stretch of highway. He knew something happened there. He thought it had to do with UFOs. Every time he hit that stretch of highway, he would floor it, have a panic attack, drive through it, and once he's through it, he's okay. And he knew something happened there, and we did hypnotic regression. A psychologist did it, which scared the psychologist so much that he never did it again for us. And out came a full-fledged abduction. So I began to realize that this whole thing might be infinitely more widespread than anyone thought. And I actually made the statement in Missing Time, in my first book, that it was highly possible that there had been more UFO abductions than UFO sightings. Now, the general theory was that UFO abduction was a function of the sightings, but I thought it might be the other way around. So when I published the book, I had new things to say about the patterns that I discovered, and that's what interested me. These were not just random accounts, but they had a kind of unity. And one of the things that I mentioned in the book was something I'd run into was this idea of screen memories, where people could remember seeing, a 5-foot owl walking up. One case walked right up to the front of the car. They had to stop, and the owl was staring at them across the hood of the car. A very tall owl. And there was some mystery about what really happened. And but when the owl left, it went straight up. And I said, it must have had tremendous wingspan. Oh, no, it didn't have any wings. It was a wingless 5-foot owl. Well, under hypnosis, of course, we know what the owl turned out to be. Another thing I discovered, which was extremely important at the time, was that people were abducted more than once. Again, we had this idea, just the poor hills were just in the wrong Betty and Barney Hill. If they hadn't been in the White Mountains, it never would have happened. Not so. I mean, it probably happened again and again. I've discussed this with Betty and her niece, incidentally. But at any rate, the fact that people were being abducted again and again gave us a sense of a real purposefulness of the phenomenon. They're after something here. They're studying people in a certain way. And the whole idea of marks and bruises and so forth. Well, these are some of the things that I stumbled along the way into, aspects of the phenomenon. So I'm just trying to give you a background of how the phenomenon itself, with its patterns, began by just the sheer weight of its own data to force us to accept something that seemed really pretty off the wall. Now, I'm at a point in my life, I've been doing this for 28 years, that in my latest book, Sight Unseen, I'm taking on two things that are, I'm convinced, aspects of the phenomenon, of the patterns, that are pretty off the wall. And the first is something that we all knew about, really intuitively, and that was when an abduction took place, you could not see it. Abductions take place in downtown Detroit. I've worked with people abducted out of Tokyo, New York City in the middle of the day, Paris, Rome, you name it. Now, we have no accounts, except for the Linda Cortile account, which was a deliberate showing off of what they could do. We have no accounts of people saying, yeah, I was driving along and I saw somebody going up a beam of light. Never happens. Yet there are thousands and thousands of abductions every year. They must not be seeable. Seems to be the only answer. So we understood that there is a technology of invisibility that allows the UFO occupants to keep things covert and also to be able to operate just at will, any place. I've had people who were taken right out of an army base, on a drill field. Things that can't be imagined. No one sees somebody going up a beam of light or into a craft. I don't see the craft either. So I wrote about invisibility and many, many cases, including in Sight Unseen, a case where one woman, or as a young girl, sees her friend literally disappear in front of her eyes, as if she's sort of vibrating. She said it was as if there was a piece of thick plastic wiggling in front of her, and then she was gone. And she somehow popped back in a little later, after presumably the abduction was over. There are many, many cases, and I'm going to go into one of them here in particular in a few minutes. But the invisibility is the first thing we're going to talk about. And the second thing is perhaps just as radical, maybe more so. And that is, in the UFO occupants' basic goal, which seems to be to create a mix, a genetic mix between themselves and ourselves. For what purpose, we're not sure. But they seem to be interested in creating beings that can exist on Earth, breathe our air, presumably, or eat our food, or whatever, excuse me, and who can pass. Of course, many of those early Men in Black stories, which we remember, they weren't always in black, but at any rate, many of those early stories showed people who looked human but not quite human. They looked strange. They looked like they didn't quite fit or know how to operate, and they could disappear. They could come through walls, etc. In other words, they have alien characteristics but a lot of very human characteristics. And the idea that they could actually be operating daily in our world, driving a car, going shopping, etc., seems really off the wall, and yet there's enough evidence that I've accumulated over the years to believe that that's actually going on. And those are the stories I'll talk about a little bit later. What I want to start with, but you have to admit, these are pretty far out areas of patterns. One thing to talk about scoop marks and cuts and so forth. Another thing to talk about the guy sitting next to you in the movie theater might be not from here. Now, what I'm going to do first here is I'm going to present a tape. Yeah, if you could flip it on just a second. I'll give you the background. This is a very interesting tape. It's a man named Frank, who is a great person. He lives in Ticonderoga, New York, way upstate New York. He's a corrections officer, works in a prison as a guard. He's married. He has grandchildren. One of his children is a police officer. He's a very, very solid citizen. He's been having odd experiences all his life. There's no doubt in my mind at this point that he has had abduction experiences. But this particular time, he was very busy with his video camera all the time, looking for a UFO. He walked outside late afternoon in the summer. His wife was planting some flowers and things, and he sees this object in the sky. Runs in, gets his camera, runs out, and starts to film it. One of the interesting things about the film, which I'm going to show you, is that it's silent. He doesn't say to his wife, and I'm sure most of you have seen a videotape that somebody's made, and the soundtrack is, "Hey, look, it's going behind there. We'll see it over there. Yeah, there it is. What is?" You know, there's a busy, active thing. Dead silence. He films this thing. Now, his recollection was as follows. First of all, the thing is peanut-shaped. It's an odd shape, and other cases have turned up of a very similar object in some other reports. One has been photographed by a police chief in the South. But at any rate, the thing that's most interesting, interested me at the time, is when he finished filming it, he walked in the house, still carrying the camera turned on, and there's this sense of the movement of his body as he's walking along, and he's filming nothing, just the background. Very odd. Goes in the house, puts the camera away, goes in the kitchen, and doesn't remember what happened for the next 4 hours. And neither does his wife. They don't remember anything about the meal or anything. Worse than that, they didn't remember that he had filmed a UFO. Now, this is, of course, outrageous, because anybody who's just taken a UFO film or video is going to be saying, "My gosh, I got to view it, see what I've got." It took him a week before he looked at it. Well, what happened ultimately when we started looking into this was that he filmed this thing, videotaped it, and then under some kind of control walked in the house, walked into the kitchen, and went directly straight up through the roof of the kitchen into the very same craft he's just photographed, and it was hovering 50 feet up or something above the house. What this has to do with invisibility is the fact that it would seem that this object, of course, is visible, would have been visible to anybody because it registered on videotape, and they saw it. But that presumably, if it was 50 feet above his house on a street lined with houses, cars going by, daylight, and nobody saw it, that at that point probably nobody saw the craft or saw him coming straight through the roof and going into the craft. That would imply that invisibility got switched on, as it were. So if we can have that, it's all cued. I hope you can see it. It starts with his showing the... there's not much soundtrack here. First, you'll see the craft, and you'll see it passing behind the steeple. And then he plays it again and again so you can see it better. Bird sounds. This is He's repeating it, then he'll do it in slow motion. You know, he loses it for a minute, and then he finds it. It's going in and out of clouds. Bruce Maccabee analyzed this, and they could find out a lot about the weather that day and the cloud cover. And Maccabee has pronounced this a legitimate large object, wingless, self-illuminated. You'll see it again when he misses it, of course, and then goes and picks it up, trying to find it. And then it comes out of the clouds, and there it is going.
And this is all before he went into the house.
I'm sorry?
This is all before he went back into the house.
Yeah, before he went in the house. This is what he's doing out there filming it. And then he goes in the house, and the whole thing unfolds. Now he has some little stills, so you see it quickly. I think we can, could we turn on the slide, first slide? Okay. See it again. I think we can turn off the videotape because you'll just see this repeat. Now, you get a very good shot of what this object looked like, this odd. Bruce Maccabee felt it was self-illuminated, as I said, peanut-shaped thing. Well, this is what happened after the whole thing became known, and he'd sent the tape to Maccabee and it had been approved of and so forth. Maccabee said, to make my calculations about the altitude of this thing, its approximate size, and all the necessary things, he said, I need to know how tall the church steeple is. So Frank happens to be a lapsed Roman Catholic. And he said, I don't know how I'm going to find out. And Bruce said, we just have to go into the church and ask the priest. He felt very uneasy. When he went in to ask the priest, he was resolved he wasn't going to say why he needed to know. But of course, you walk in and you say, how tall is your church? You know, and the priest, who was, he said, this, to him, very unpleasant man sitting behind this extraordinarily ornate desk. Thought it was quite an extravagance. The priest naturally said, why do you have to know how high the church is? And he muttered something, and then finally, Frank did. Finally, he thought, well, I'll just face it. He said, well, I have to find out because I filmed a UFO passing over that church steeple some time ago, and the optical physicist who's studying the film needs for his calculations the exact height of the steeple. And the priest, he said, leaned back in his chair and roared with laughter at him and said, surely you don't believe in something as crazy as UFOs, do you? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, I do. And he turned to the priest and said, I assume you believe in God and Jesus and the Virgin Mary. And the priest said, well, of course I do. And he said, got any pictures? I've got pictures. So now, of course, he didn't get what he needed to know, but it's very clever. This is a very clever man. He decided that he could figure out how tall the steeple was by the following means. He went to the lumber yard, bought a 2x4, cut it exactly to 10 feet, went up next to the church, held it upright, and he had his wife down the block photograph it so that when the photograph came out, they could use the 10-foot module and find out the height of it, and they solved the problem. Now, we're going to move into some issues having to do with invisibility, and I don't know whether you have somebody to run the slide projector. Yeah, okay, great. Let's have the next slide then. Thanks, Ruben. Now, when I was in Australia a number of years ago giving some talks, I was in Brisbane, and it's an interesting thing, the background of this. Those of you who have read Witness will remember that Linda Cortila, the central person, her son had a friend over for the weekend. It was a holiday weekend. And so this other boy stayed in Linda's younger son's bed, so the two boys were in the same room. Her younger son stayed in bed with his father, and Linda slept in the living room. She woke up at 2 in the morning or so, choking and gagging, and when she sat up, blood was streaming out of her right nostril. And this is in the book, within seconds, her son came in, the older son, bleeding from the right nostril, and his friend, the guest, came in bleeding from the right nostril, and the husband came in bleeding from the right nostril, and the other son, every one of them at the same instant. And this is the kind of thing, as I say, Carl Sagan would call a mass hysteria. But the point is that they've all apparently had some kind of experience simultaneously. When I told that story in Brisbane, this couple had come up afterwards, said, you know, we had something happen last week, including our son, who was there with us, and we all three woke up at the same hour bleeding from the right nostril, and this really, really upset them. But this woman said, we've had some experiences, and especially my husband, and this man was very, very nervous, a very nice man, very shy, and he told me some of the experiences. But then he said, his wife said, well, have you ever seen anything like this? And she hands me 3 pictures, this being the first one. May I have the next one? The next one? We'll wait for a moment here. She handed me these 3, and she said, have you seen anything like this? And I assumed it had to do with the red color, and I said no. She said that, I asked if it was color film. She said it was all color film. These pictures are kind of in the middle of the roll, and they were the only red ones, and everything else was normal. And I said, well, I've never seen this before, not knowing really what to make of even the question. And she said, but that's not the problem, the redness. She said, the problem is we're supposed to be in that picture, and we're not. And in all 3 pictures, may we see the next one too? I mean, you wouldn't even take a picture like that if there aren't people standing in the foreground. There's a little stain on there. That's not an orb or something. Can I see the previous one again? Now, this is what happened. She said they went to the park, and this is very close to home. Their 2 little kids who were 4 and 6 or whatever in age loved to come to this playground, and it was right on the water. And they were having a good time, and then they began to all feel very funny, very strange. And she said at some point, we just really wanted to get out of there, all of us together. And so we left. And the boys never wanted to go back to this park again, ever, she said. This was really strange. And at any rate, I didn't say anything about what I suspected. But I was able to do a longer interview with her the next day, and I did a hypnotic regression. And what came out is she was taking a couple of pictures of the boys and her husband, and then she handed him the camera, and they walked along, and they were in a different location, and just very casually. And he was taking a picture like this, and under hypnosis, she's describing this, and all of a sudden, she said, we're going up. Now, this is a playground, a park, on a Saturday afternoon, people all around, middle of the day, noonish. Up they went, and she sensed light all around her, brighter than the sunlight in that day. And they went up into an object. She was taken into one room off to the side, and various procedures, which are very typical, which we won't go into here, were carried out. But when she was separated from her children, she was in terror and crying and extremely upset under hypnosis, and I had to reassure her. And actually, we kind of jumped over some of it to the point where she's back with the children because she didn't know what was going to happen. They took them away from her, and she couldn't move. And obviously, that would be a terrifying thing to a mother in that situation. So as they started back down, there was a hole in the center of the thing on the floor. Down they came, and as they're coming down, she described seeing her husband standing there like this with the camera. We don't know how much time elapsed, but let's say half an hour, I don't know what. And as soon as they were on the ground, they just forgot everything and walked over to the husband, and he said, let's go home. And they all left. I did hypnosis with him the second day, and she wanted very much for me to do this because she could not believe that this actually happened to her. She wanted to see what would come out with him. And with him, it was a very touching thing. I go into it in great depth in the book with the text of the hypnotic sessions. At any rate, he's taking the picture, and all of a sudden he says, you know, they're going up. and just with great panic, and he said, they don't even look surprised, as if the expressions and the posture and everything is just frozen, and up they go. And he's holding the camera, and so I did a few of my false leads that I will do in a case like that. I said, I imagine you turn to the people in the playground and call and cry for help. He said, I can't move. I don't say anything. And I said, well, I imagine after a while somebody comes over to you because you're just standing there holding the camera and asks if you're all right. He said, no, I don't think they can see me. Now, the basic point of this is, in some way, at some point, perhaps coincident with when the film turns red, they are rendered invisible. But they see each other, and they see everything normally. They're not aware that there's anything unusual. And when this little film thing takes place, and up they go, no one sees that, no one sees the husband. I don't know, but I assume that if people had looked over when they popped back into reality, it might have been a shock. And that has happened. That has been reported. And one of the cases there involving Katharina Wilson I deal with in the book. It's a very interesting case where she suddenly appeared. But at any rate, this is how the invisibility phenomenon manifests itself. And it's the only way these things can be done in a normal way without alerting a wide public. Next slide. And the one after this. Now, again, just going back to some basic things, the way in which we can see these objects and how the pieces of the puzzle begin to fit together. This is a photograph that was sent to me. Actually, it wasn't like this. This was, when the photograph was sent, it was a parking lot with lights, and these objects were together up in the upper right corner. I think this was an Alabama case. And it's very interesting because what we have here are this formation, which I think probably is familiar to many of you, of a kind of a ring or a delta thing with one object behind. And each one has a ring of light on the bottom, perhaps the hole that people go through. Next slide. Now, just to take one of the Gulf Breeze photographs, which is much more of a close-up. And of course, here we have a sense of what perhaps one of those objects in that group photograph would look like if we'd seen it closer. It's a very similar kind of idea, that circular light on the bottom. And actually, Gulf Breeze was not all that huge distance away from where that first photograph was taken. Next slide. And this, of course, is a fascinating picture because this is one of the Gulf Breeze photographs that in the Polaroid, the original one, is almost black except for the light on the bottom and on the top. You see very, very little. But Bruce Maccabee, doing the analysis, just flooded this little Polaroid, this black little Polaroid, with light and with fast film, and was able to take this picture and blow it up and pick up these details that were not there otherwise. And of course, as the kind of thing I said, people like to say, oh, this can't be a real photograph, but those little distant things I can accept. I'm much more comfortable being way out there. Next slide. Now, again, this is going back into some of the patterns here. I'm going to show you some alien drawings from 20 years ago. 20 years ago. And of course, nowadays, as I say, you can get everything. Christmas tree ornaments with alien faces, bath mats, whatever. It's all, every T-shirt, every other T-shirt has a face on it. So it's become a kind of ubiquitous pop culture image. But this is drawn by Kathy Davis, Debbie Jordan, who I wrote about in Witness, back in the early 80s. And at that point, it was not that well known. But it's the standard gray figure. Debbie made a wonderful remark to me about this. She's a cosmetologist, which is hairdo rather than cosmic effect. And she's conscious of those things. She said, a friend of hers said, Debbie, I can't accept that drawing. How can you get a turtleneck over a head like that? And of course, she said, well, I don't know, maybe they have some kind of zipper. I don't know. We have the next slide. Now, at the time that she made that drawing, MUFON had this drawing a little bit later on the cover. and it was drawn by somebody different. And when Debbie had given me her drawing, so she didn't have it around, and then she got the MUFON Journal and saw this, she thought, oh, Bud put my picture on the front of MUFON Journal. And then she looked at it and she said, no, that doesn't look right, and saw that in fact it's by somebody else. Now again, 20 years ago, we have the next slide. She said that when she saw this drawing that she had not made, looking so much like what she had seen, she went through what I call confirmation anxiety. It's the situation when an abductee suddenly realizes, oh my God, this really happened. Because almost everybody wants to put it on some plane. Well, maybe there's an explanation. Maybe I dreamed it, or it was something. You know, you kind of keep it in a limbo. You don't like it to be that real. It takes a while before you can accept it. And she said when she saw this, she said, I didn't tell you what happened, Bud, but I went upstairs and went in the bathroom and threw up. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Now, again, we have, from 20 years ago, we have drawings like this, and these are all cases I've worked with. Each one, of course, has a huge story connected with it that I can't go into. But the whole praying mantis idea, the thing that's insect-like, which shares with the other drawings this tiny neck that doesn't look strong enough to support the head. But here the jaw is kind of a mandible, and it certainly looks more insect-like. These are often seen as very, very tall, of course, as you know. And I always liked the story that Carla Turner told, that her first UFO experience consciously remembered was that she was outside in the middle of the night at the age of 5, standing in the yard, facing a 7-foot-tall praying mantis. She said, and it was trying to tell me it was my mother. That's a stretch, but at any rate. Now, if you took that head and imagined it in going into an absolute profile to look into another case, if we can have the next slide. This is a different case. This is a Michigan case. But here, you have the same exact kind of thing with this long pointed chin, this tiny neck, virtually no features except the eyes, and probably from the front looking virtually exactly like this other thing. And again, people ask many times, how many races, how many types are there? And of course, you know, it's been mentioned something about the reptilian physical type, and which is much rarer, much rarer, but you do hear about it. And the praying mantis, insect-like, and of course the standard grays coming in, the little ones and the taller ones and so forth. Plus, many people report seeing beings in the craft that are more human or in between, quote-unquote, hybrid types. But the basic rule has always been that in these descriptions, they're always together in the same ship doing the same thing, cooperatively. So you don't have Group A doing one thing and Group B doing something else. Next slide. Now, just another quick review of this idea of which I go into in the book, again, of scoop marks and physical marks on the body. The thing that is so interesting to me about the way this subject was received in its early days was the nuts and bolsters, people who liked the whole thing being you know, armor plated, you could wrap your knuckles on it and so forth. It was all very, very rigid, and was almost fitted into a sort of Cold War mentality. I remember a case in NICAP where a man was on a motorcycle and this craft came down above him and he was going faster and faster, and he's in the middle of nowhere, and of course undoubtedly more happened than the investigators thought at the time. There was probably an abduction. You don't have a situation where a craft comes down right above a man on a motorcycle without there being more to it. They don't just do that and scare you and leave. But at the time, thinking of the Cold War mentality, one of the writers about this particular case said what he thought this was about was that the UFO was trying to find out the top speed of a Harley Davidson. So that kind of mindset was one thing. And on the other side, of course, you had the whole contactee mindset, and that this is all spiritual and wonderful and sort of paranormal and whatnot. But of course, what we learned all along is that both sides of it are part of the phenomenon. the whole physical nuts and bolts thing, the fact that a mark is left on a person very often after an abduction, a layer of tissue has been removed, tree branches are broken, the ground is baked, you name it, photographs can be taken. The physical side is there. And of course, also is this totally paranormal side. All communication, as you know, is telepathic. Things are invisible. Apparently, they can float you right straight through a wall. So the range is such a complicated thing that it displeased everybody in the early days, because you had to accept that entire range from the most physical to the least physical in order to begin to understand the data. Of course, in these cases, this was on a 5-year-old boy in the Bronx in New York, and it turned up right after an abduction experience. Interestingly, his father had taken him to a doctor for a rash that he had on his leg, this on the lower leg, or his thigh, I guess. And the doctor gave him some salve and told him to come back in 3 days or something like that, and would see if it cleared up. And when he came back 3 days later, this thing was there. And the doctor could not believe it, because it wasn't there when he put the salve on to start with. He examined the leg, and now here it is, healed. And I'm sure the doctor was extremely distressed, and probably the thought went through his mind that this was a cigarette burn and this child had a sadistic father or something. Who knows what he was thinking? But it was, of course, impossible in terms of tissues and healing. Next slide. Another very small one in the front. I have hundreds of these. Next slide. You're not going to see hundreds, but anyway. This is a case in Australia where a woman who was a nurse was taken out of her crib when she was 2 or 3 months old. And this is what her parents found when they put her clothes back on. So this woman has had a lifetime of abduction experiences. This is really a kind of dimpled wound with a long straight line coming out of it. Not quite a scoop mark, but quite disfiguring. Next slide. And this is a typical straight line cut from the back of the leg. It's an illustration I used years ago, and I got this in the 1970s, and I used it in Missing Time. This girl at the age of 16 had gone into the woods and at a picnic, and the family had been looking for her for 2 hours, calling for her. And when she came out of the woods, magically, not having heard anything, she talked about talking to this wonderful deer that came right up with big black eyes, dealt with her, and she thought it was the most beautiful deer she'd ever seen, but her leg was bleeding. She had no idea how any of this happened. And of course, hypnosis revealed what the deer was. And as long as we're talking about screen memories, the one that is my favorite, which I've told many times before, but it's a recent situation where a man I know who has had abduction experiences was talking to me over and over again about his cousin, a woman who lived in the country, rural area, who had had all of these obvious experiences all her life, but always explained them away. There's some, maybe I dreamed, there was something or other, and she would never even entertain the possibility that she'd had anything really, really unusual happen. But she told him one day that she was driving home in the evening, and this absolutely beautiful cow came up to the car with these big, black, soulful eyes, and just looked in the window of the car and stared at her. And she said it was really the most beautiful cow she'd ever seen, and the amazing thing was she was going 45 miles an hour the whole time. So what we said, it was a thoroughbred cow that could run sideways very fast. But still, the mindset had been so imprinted in her mind that this had a normal explanation, that that's what she assumed. But next slide, please. And the Kelly Cahill case from Australia, I know many of you must know about it, but she was with her husband driving along a country road, and at night in rural Australia. There was a car in front and one in back just on this highway, and all cars stopped, the three of them. And she found herself and her husband getting out of the car and walking into this field where this craft was parked. And as they walked in, she saw the people from the other cars going into the field too. And the next thing they knew, she's back in the car, and the thing isn't there, and they're all mixed up, the time is off. any rate, she remembered some of it, and she reported it, and there was an article put in the paper. And ultimately, the people in the other two cars, one of whom was a police officer, as I remember, came forward and contacted her. And every one of them had a ring around the ankle like this, both ankles, as if some kind of restraint had been put in place. It's a very, very interesting case. Next slide. Now, just one last thing about some of the physical aspects of all this. This is the X-ray of Linda Cortilla's nose with its implant in place. And what she remembered consciously about this was, as a child, not a child, she was a new mother at the time. She noticed this bump on the side of her nose, and bothered her and bothered her. She went to the doctor, and he asked what kind of surgery she'd had, because it was a scar up her nose. And she said she had had none, but this really, really upset her. And as a matter of fact, when I first met her and she came to me, she still had the receipt of her visit to the doctor, which for some reason she knew was important and saved, where the doctor had collected the money for examining her. Finally, the X-ray was done, and when it was done, and this was the result, before we had a chance to do anything, she woke up about a week later in the middle of the night with some memory of something happening, and she was bleeding profusely from the right nostril. And when she was checked again by X-ray, there was nothing there except a cut. Now, she remembered a needle going in with some small object on the end, but she didn't see anything this big. It's as if the thing somehow expanded in some way or other. And for those of you who saw Dr. Lear's recent videotape of trying to locate this little rod-like thing in a woman's cheek, which was highly magnetized, and as the tool, the pincer, whatever they were using, came close to it, it would move away. As it was being repelled by the pincers, and they had to use two different ones to get it, sneak up on it, to get the thing out. And when they put it down, this little rod-like thing, on some cotton, he said that all surgical tools are treated so that they are totally without any magnetic draw whatsoever. But this was put down, still attached to the little object, and it was lying across another one of his tools he had used, surgical tools, and he found that they were stuck together with magnetic force, that somehow this thing had managed to, instead of being repelled, it became attracted to the tools and magnetized them, which is quite powerful. Anyway, these things are very mysterious. We have the next slide, please. But I think the most important ones are ones that are found inside the skull, where they couldn't possibly have gotten. And these are photographs, X-rays of a girl, 5-year-old girl, whose parents took her to Italy on a trip. Her father was stationed in the army in Wiesbaden, Germany. And she had been reporting experiences as a 5-year-old, little men coming in the room at night. She was terrified. She didn't want to sleep in there. The whole range of issues. But when she was in Italy, she fell off her bicycle, some accident, and they took her to the hospital to X-ray her to see if she had fractured her skull. And the 3 X-rays I'm going to show you, there was no skull fracture. But what you see in the eye socket on the left, just at the bottom of the eye socket on the left, there's a little white squarish thing. And that is a metal object. Now, the point of view is almost from beneath her chin upwards, so that they can get a 3-dimensional sense of anything in her head this way. So the object is, from this perspective, is in the eye socket at the very bottom. Now, next slide. This shows now a view down from the top. And the object, as you can see very clearly, is at the top on the left side. Now, if you have the next slide, you see it from the side, and you can see the object very clearly behind the eye, where it's actually located. A neurosurgeon friend of mine who looked at these said, well, Bud, that's a metallic object. He said, I don't know how it got in there, but there's no getting it out, because it's very deep in the brain, and it would be extremely risky to even attempt it. What happened was this little girl and her family went back to Wiesbaden, and they took her to the army doctor at the base there, re-x-rayed her, and it was gone. Just as in the Linda Cortila thing. It's almost as if a little alarm goes off up in the sky when these things are photographed, or located, and they're removed. And of course, in terms of how it gets in and out, if they can float you right straight through a brick wall, I assume that they can float an object like this right through the skull. We don't know how it works, and of course, above everything, we don't know what these are for. In terms of why the scoop marks exist, why the flesh is removed, those are things that, again, we don't understand. Now, we can theorize, of course. The thing about what I've done in my book, Sight Unseen, with my wife, is that we've gone into a lot of these aspects of the UFO phenomenon, especially in the invisibility issue, and then the creation of these transgenic beings, we used to call hybrid beings. What we do is I'll write case studies, and when Betty and Barney Hill were abducted, and she had described under hypnosis this long needle being inserted in her navel. One of the skeptics, they have wonderful imaginations. We don't, but they do. One of these skeptics said, well, a needle in the navel, that's ridiculous. No, but why would anybody do that? It's obvious what that is. This is a sex-obsessed woman. The needle is a phallic symbol, and the whole thing is a kind of a concealed sexual fantasy. Well, of course, what happened a few years later, as we all know, that laparoscopy was invented, and a very basic medical procedure was introduced whereby a needle is inserted in the navel, and a sample of the amniotic fluid of a pregnant woman is removed so that the state of the fetus can be assessed. That came long after Betty Hill's story. She was told in the craft, she remembers, that this was a, quote, pregnancy test. Let's look at it this way. It has to do with pregnancy, but it's not a test, I think. Another thing that we went into in the book has to do with the procedures by which genetic engineering is being practiced now. One of the things that has happened again and again in UFO abduction cases is people would describe being in a craft, their arm is lifted, and there's some kind of scraping that goes on, scraping, as it were, the loose skin off the arm, forearm. I remember Linda Cortila described it as being something like a slightly sharpened butter knife. It was going back and forth. It doesn't break the skin, but it does, of course, free up a surface area of loose skin. And of course, people said, well, what the heck is that? You know, this is ridiculous. But of course, now it turns out that very, very often when genetic manipulation is underway, engineering, in the laboratories, they take a person's arm and they scrape it and they get the flaking skin as exactly the tissue they need without having to make a cut or a hole in somebody. So again and again, the alien technology, which seemed mysterious and magical, is now getting somehow replicated on Earth here in our own laboratories. People will describe sitting in a room like this and somebody hears their name called or a voice or something, and nobody around them hears anything. How does that work? Alien communication. But right now at MIT, and we go into this in the book, somebody has developed a focused sound wave. And they can aim some kind of device right at the person in the 6th row over to the left, and that person will hear loud and clear what is said through this machine, and the people on either side will hear anything. So again and again, we're getting closer to, just almost by accident, to alien technology. And I think that a lot of this has nothing to do with reverse engineering, but that is, in effect, what seems to be going on, and that's what we're doing in the book. Now, what I'm going to discuss next, and I think we're going to take a break now. Is that a good time? We'll take a break, but what I want to discuss now is this whole issue of the program of creating a kind of hybrid mix, a transgenic mix of aliens and humans, and how some of the accounts of how they seem to function on Earth, sometimes even mediating between the UFO occupants and the abductees, even taking an abductee to meet the UFO occupants as if they're they're part of the phenomenon and they have the abductee under complete control. But I think you said 15 minutes, 10 minutes? 10 minutes, and I'll go back to the books, but we'll resume and look into that in just a minute, and then we'll do a Q&A. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll make it 15, but
Okay.
we'll get them back.
Well, I was talking to a gentleman back, and he mentioned Jacques Vallée and an experience, investigation he had been involved on with Jacques Vallée. And I don't know why I know mischief has come into my head here today, the story about Eric von Däniken. But I am a very good friend of Tracy Torme, who some of you may know, Mel Torme's son, and he was the one who wrote the screenplay for Intruders, the miniseries on my second book. And of course, he also wrote the screenplay for Fire in the Sky. And he's done a lot of sci-fi writing and producing and so forth. A very nice man. And through him, I met a very close friend of his who is a very witty man. And I have to admit that I cannot remember his name now. It was a brief meeting. But we were out to dinner together, Tracy and this gentleman and myself, my wife. And Tracy told me a story that this man had been involved in, and Tracy, which was, to me, very, very funny. They decided that they were going to take Jacques Vallée with them and go to Area 51. And they were going to do the sneaking around at night in the car and down the little roads, past all those warning signs, you'll be shot to death if you come any further and all that. And according to Tracy, this man was getting more and more nervous, that Jacques Vallée was getting more and more nervous, and I guess they all were. And when they kept passing these ominous signs in the middle of nowhere, and of course it's all sort of desert area, and they went around some kind of a little bend, and there was a shed, and suddenly there were 4 men in camouflage gear and automatic weapons surrounding the car and stopping it. And according to Tracy, everyone was frightened, and including obviously Jacques Vallée and the other man. And these protectors, these soldiers, protectors of Area 51, came over to the car window with their rifles and said, "What are you doing here?" And Tracy's friend, who was very witty, said, "Senor, we are poor Portuguese sponge fishermen. We are lost." Probably wasn't any water within 500 miles. But they were, of course, turned around and sent home. But I thought I would give anything to be able to think that fast and that wittily in a situation like that. Any rate, to get back where we are. In terms of my quest for the patterns for what this seems to be about, back in the early 80s, I'd been at this for, at this point, 7 or 8 years, looking into abductions. Still, the big questions were, why do they pick up all these people? Why so many? And why do they pick up the same person again and again? And it was, as many of you may know from reading Intruders, it was Kathy Davis, Debbie Jordan is her name, who said, but I had a pregnancy once. And it was very odd, and she proceeded to tell me the story, and how suddenly she was not pregnant after 3 months, and there was no sign of a miscarriage, and then she remembered this quote-unquote dream of being in some kind of white space, and this little girl is being shown to her, and she's being told that this is her child. And I was, of course, staggered. There was more material. She remembered something that seemed to be a needle in her abdomen and perhaps some kind of vaginal procedure. The implication being that She had been impregnated in some way, and the developing fetus was removed, and she was then brought to some kind of confrontation with this small child. And one of the things that's I found so unbelievably touching about this story, and there was a lot more to it than, of course, that I haven't time to go into. But one of the things that was so wonderful was she said, and Debbie is a rather heavy woman, and we know what aliens look like. She said that when the little girl was brought out by one of the alien beings, and they were sort of presenting the little girl to Debbie, the little girl looked terrified of her. She felt waves of love for this baby, child, toddler, but the child seemed to be afraid of her. There was no smile, no reaction, and it tore her up that this child that she felt this automatic affection for was rejecting her. Now, that was the first case. There's lots and lots more about this, but it was the first case that led me to start asking people that I was interviewing if they'd ever had any kind of situation involving an unusual pregnancy and other kinds of related questions. And I thereby uncovered just one case after another. So what we seem to find when we put it all together is that in abductions, obviously, ova and sperm samples are taken, flesh samples, skin scrapings, and whatever the process is, it would seem that there is a kind of gene splicing going on, that alien genes are being inserted into our particular genetic makeup or vice versa. And there's this attempt to create a mix, and that therefore this is going to take a lot of different samples to get the mix that they are apparently looking for correctly. It's just a guess, we don't know. And also, taking people again and again might suggest that there's some kind of ongoing program of gene splicing. We don't know. But when I wrote this in my book, came out in 1987, I was roundly attacked by biologists and others who said, this is ridiculous, you can't make hybrids, you can't make a mix, it's impossible, can't happen. Hybrids, which is when you take a sperm from one species and mix it with an ovum from another, you get something like, for example, a mule that comes from a donkey and a horse, but which is also sterile and cannot reproduce. But this is so rare, and the scientists all told me my data were all wrong because their theory proved that you can't do this. Well, data are not trumped by theory, ever. And as I went on doing research, I got case after case after case. I have two cases that I go into slightly in some extent in the book, dealing with women who lost their pregnancy in the 7th month, disappeared. No sign of a miscarriage, no particular serious problems. It's medically impossible. But at any rate, it's usually in an earlier period. But many cases when people are confronted with these small beings, children, whatever, and many people describe seeing, walls of tanks in which these small beings are developing, apparently. And they seem to have a range of human to alien features, which varies a great deal. One of the things that Carol Rainey, my wife, has come up with is that the Japanese, a particular scientific organization in Japan, is experimenting with an artificial womb, plastic kind of object trough in which they are floating, developing fetuses of goats and sheep and so forth. Well, that's awfully much like what's been reported for years and years by people who've had abduction experiences. So what we have to assume is that this is at the heart of what the abduction phenomenon is about. I've long since thought that there are qualities that we have, our emotional range, our basic physicality, our sexuality, all kinds of things, that they seem to lack themselves and seem to be interested in splicing into their own systems. Now, when they produce these mixed beings, which I'll talk about in a minute, we don't know what their ultimate purpose is. Are they going to infiltrate? Are they going to kidnap Dick Cheney and take over the country? Or what are they going? We have no idea. Some people think it's a good idea, but I think he's already taken over the country, I have to say. But at any rate, we don't know the ultimate outcome of this. And I'm going to give you some illustrations of what happens in some of these cases. If I have the next slide, and we'll look at some of the drawings people have made. I have several drawings of, reproduced in the book actually and elsewhere, of people holding in their hand one of these tiny developing babies. Now some, as in this case, looks totally alien, but some of them have more human features. What's often said by way of description is that these small creatures seem listless, as if they're not healthy. Next slide. This is a drawing made by an obstetrical nurse who was herself an abductee, and she said, all conscious recollection, that when she was handed this child and the aliens seemed desperate that the putative parent, and some of these are males rather than just females, that the putative parent bonds with that child as if the aliens believe there's something magical in the human touch, which we know there is in a strange way. You know, that syndrome called a failure to thrive, where babies somehow don't develop in a healthy way. And touch is regarded as tremendously important, the holding, the bonding. And it's as if the aliens understand that. And so they want the people to hold these babies. This woman was repelled, unlike Kathy Davis, who wanted to embrace her child who was afraid to come near her. This woman said, as an obstetrical nurse, this child should not be allowed to live. She said its neck will not support its head, and the mouth has no musculature, there can't be any suckling, and it will never live. And the alien who presented it took it away from her. I'm not sure that she actually even held it, and seemed a little miffed. Alien emotions are in a very narrow range, and said he'd give her something else to do. But one of the things that's interesting here is she described the hair as not covering the head in an even way. Some comes here and some comes there. And this is something that many, many people describe when they are shown these little babies. The hair is usually a whitish, blonde color. And incidentally, I have a story in the book which is very interesting about a little girl who was abducted and taken to a playground and in the middle of the night and shown a group of she was presented to a group of little children who she said didn't look like us and didn't look like him either, the alien who was taking her there. And the alien's instruction to her was that she was to play on the swings and slides in the middle of the night in the playground to show these children how to play. And she said these little children had sort of white hair, and she said they were all twins, meaning they all looked alike. And they didn't smile at her, and they didn't say hello, and she didn't like them. And she didn't like to play by herself, but she had to because apparently it was an instructional thing. But anyway, this white hair that's described again and again, and I've mentioned that I've had 3 different women I worked with who, when they were handed this child, a little baby or a little toddler, with this white hair that didn't quite cover the head, it was very sparse and irregular, 3 different women have said under hypnosis, their hair, no one's brushing their hair. No one's taking care of their hair. They don't understand hair. And of course, that to me is the kind of observation that comes from really seeing something. That's not out of fantasy. That's not a fantasy thing. That's really, they're looking, and as a mother who's already had her own children feels that their hair looks awful. Next slide. This is another little model made by a woman who has seen this child, and she's seen this child apparently at different times when she was abducted and meant to bond with the child, even up to the age of the child being a teenager, it would seem. But here, even though this child seems to have no hair, the more human feature is the fact that the eyes are very big with a lot of white to the eye and blue irises, which is the usual variant on this particular kind of alien baby. Next slide. This is Kathy Davis' drawing of the little child she was shown, trying to indicate the hair not really covering the scalp. The very large eyes, blue, the tiny features, the mix of alien human characteristics. Next slide. Now, we have some adult cases where, and this comes from the Linda Cortila case actually, where beings that have, again, a mixture. Here the eyes are alien eyes, but there's the fuller lips and something of a nose. And in some of these cases, actually I've dealt with maybe 5 or 6, the person viewing this kind of being have said that they look like they're wearing wigs. Next slide. Here's another one from a case in Oregon. And here's again that situation of something that looks like a wig. And I think they look more like Walmart than a more expensive place, actually. Now we can turn off the slides. Now, I want to relate one story from the book, which shows the complexity of when some of these beings really can pass as normal humans, some of the things that seem to happen. I was working with a young woman, mother, had a couple of children, had many experiences. This is quite some years ago. And she said to me, and this often happens when you're working with somebody, she said, you know, but there's something I never told you about that's very strange. It's an odd experience. I don't know whether it's connected with this or not. So, of course, I was curious. And the story was that when she was 16, she was sitting in a pizza parlor with a couple of her friends, and this man came over, and he seemed like a normal-looking man. He had salt and pepper hair, and she thought he was middle-aged, didn't look odd. And he said to her, would you like a job, a summer job? And she was thinking of that, and she said, well, yes, I would. And he said, good, I'll pick you up tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and we'll have an interview. And her friend said, gee, isn't that great? You're going to have a job. And the man left. Well, there wasn't much discussion of where she lived or anything like that. And 2 o'clock the next day, she told her mother, a strange man came up to me and asked me to come for a job interview. He's going to come here at 2 o'clock. And her mother said, great, terrific, good luck. 16-year-old, pretty little girl. And she said years later, her mother just shakes her head and said, how could I have ever thought that I could do a thing like that? No questions. The car drove up, normal car, and stopped out front, and she went running out and got in the car. The man was at the wheel. And the instant she got in the car, and this part now is under hypnosis, she felt extremely strange. She said, I feel tiny, as if I'm shrunken, like my soul, something. She felt extremely uneasy. Now, this is not a woman given to that kind of talk. The man starts off in the car and says, I guess you had a good time yesterday afternoon. And she said, what do you mean? And he said, with your boyfriend. She had lost her virginity the afternoon before. And she, of course, thought, how in the world does he know that? You know. But she felt powerless. And then he started telling her about her early life, about things that happened when she was 3 and 4, about her grandparents, about her stepfather. He knew everything about her, everything. And she had felt no power to say anything, get out of the car, do anything. Now, she had consciously remembered that when they pulled up to this building, they went up some steps for the job interview, and she's going with him, no problem. You would imagine at that point, if you're under your own control, you're not going to go with this man. You're going to go to a phone booth and call your mother to come and get you. They go up and they go into this place, which she said was just a big empty room. There was a desk and a chair, and that was it. There's a map on the wall. She said there was nothing else there. She didn't even think there was a telephone. So he starts telling her about the job, which is that she's going to be involved in some kind of transportation, routing, something like that. Her father had been in a trucking business, so she had some sense of what this was. But so far, no one has written anything down. There's no names, anything about addresses or when this is going to start or what the money is or anything. And this man says to her, this job will be very good and you'll do very well, but you have to do with me what you did with your boyfriend, which of course he couldn't even known about. And she said, oh no, I can't do this. And he was not saying anything which was seductive or trying to, you know, say, gee, you're a pretty little girl, and you know, whatever, and make you some money here or something. It was just a bold thing. You have to do with me what you did with your boyfriend. And he, incidentally, in the car, described to her what she and her boyfriend had done together in some detail. So she backs away, and she said, I have to leave. And he said, I'll take you home. And they go out the door, and they go downstairs, and she gets in the car with him again. She felt really under control. This was not herself really doing this. She gets in the car, and he drives out to the country somewhere. This is in New Jersey. He's not going near her house. And she just sits there, and there's nothing said. He pulls into a field, and she sees this peculiar round house, which has glass all around it. They pull up to this round house, and she doesn't know what this is, but it's on the ground, and it's a house, but it isn't a house. And now again, this part is hypnotically retrieved. The man gets out of the car, and she sits there. And I said, I imagine you get out your side and run back to the highway. No, she's too afraid. Can't do anything, just sits there. Man comes out of the house, and of course, he's with 4 little aliens. And they come over to the car, and she's taken out of the car. The rest of this is a little unclear because we didn't pursue it too far. She was very upset about this. So we don't know exactly what happened. Then she's put back in the car, and he drives her home, and she goes home into the house, having forgotten all about the alien thing and about the fact that this man knew everything about her. Now, this, just in itself, you would say, well, this is some sort of crazy story, and how can we accept it? And all I can say is, of course, I have great faith in this woman's veracity. But I've got 2 other cases, completely independent, of young women who were taken on a job interview in much the same circumstances, and these job interview, quote unquote, ended up involved in abduction experiences, and there were, in each case, strange, normal-looking humans who facilitated the abduction. Now, these are just some of the cases I go into in the book, but it would seem, when you go through all of these cases again and again, that there is some sort of presence here on Earth which helps facilitate the alien abduction procedures. We don't know exactly how or why this operates in this particular way, but it certainly seems to operate. And I present a number of these cases. Some of them are very gripping. And the most important scientific part of this is that Carol Rainey, my wife, presents a wide range of information about what we are doing now genetically in terms of this kind of gene splicing, gene engineering, which seems to be a version of what the aliens seem to have been doing for a long time. And one of the cases that she mentions, which many of you probably know about, is, as an experiment, a gene from a jellyfish was inserted into the ovum of a rabbit and made to be spliced into the rabbit's genetic line. And when the rabbit was born, they could take the rabbit and put it under a black light, and it glows. Now, if I had said back in 1987 in Witness, in Intruders, that a story like that we're going to have a glow-in-the-dark rabbit because of gene splicing that we can do, I would have been really laughed out of town. But the point is that if you follow the data carefully, because data never loses out to theory, when you follow the data, you come around to the point that these things are happening whether science likes it or not, or whether it fits into the scientific mold of the present. Remember, science is always what is known or thought to be known at any given time. That's all science is. If we're lucky, there's going to be a 22nd century science that's going to be so wild in relation to what we're up against now. So what we're trying to do is to establish the reality of the UFO phenomenon through some of the physical evidence I've shown, but some of the analogies between human technology and capabilities right now and alien capabilities. Both of those areas are coming together. And what I'd like to do now is to get some questions if anybody's interested, if we can have the lights and, yeah, questions, sir?
We're going to pass the microphone around.
Have some microphones? Okay, let's see how we do this.
What do you mean that they're coming together?
Well, I should say the distance between them is diminishing. I probably misspoke. I don't mean that there's some kind of communication. And I think, you see, alien science is its own thing, and whether any of these methods or ways in which we're doing things are similar or not, I have no idea. I'm just saying as long as we can open the door on the possibility, the alien science seems less magical. But the point is that many years ago, the UFO phenomenon was attacked all the time on the grounds that it's impossible. Our science says you can't do that. What scientists have been able to do with light, they've been able to slow down the speed of light. There are many fascinating things. For instance, and this has gone into in the book, they have found now that with crossing two laser beams, very, very tiny laser beams, with a tiny particle at the crossing, they can actually elevate the object by those laser beams. Now, I don't know how that makes people go up a beam of light in a UFO, but the point is, that's not so magical anymore. And that's really all I had meant by that. Now, question?
Will you tell us, there was a story mentioned about a child in London who woke up in another house?
Oh, I'm sorry. Got to tell that story. It's a really good story. We just get going and all this stuff. And this also has to do with the issue of invisibility. This young man, and I've worked with him now, he's come to the United States and we've done some hypnotic regressions. A very, very fine person. He came with his wife. But of the many things that he remembered, he told me about this incident when he was 16. Now, this is a man who, until about 2 years ago, had no idea that he had had abduction experiences. He had all of these odd things happen to him, and he put them someplace. It must be this, it must be that. And he had no way of explaining this particular incident. But when he was 16, he went to a party at the house of a friend named John, who he worked with. Never been there before. John had a lot of friends, young boys. They were all between 16 and 20. And they were there because there was a David Bowie special on television. They were great David Bowie fans. This man is now 36, so you can figure it's 20 years ago. And so somebody brought in, because John's parents had gone away for the weekend and taken his sister. So he had the house to themselves. They brought in some beer. One of the boys got very drunk. We'll call him Jim. The party was over, and somebody had to take Jim home. And the central man of my story, Stephen, was going to spend the night there because it was some distance from his home. It was really late. David Bowie was over. So John, the host, said, "You can sleep in my sister's bed." Under hypnosis, it was very, very sweet. He said, "She has a really little bed. I have to take all the dolls off the bed to get into bed." It was a typical little girl's room loaded up with things. Now, he slept nude at the time. So he took off his clothes, got in bed, went to sleep. He woke up in the morning, and he felt very odd. And he looked around, and he thought, the room looks different. He remembered big windows and a lot of light. He was on the 3rd floor of an apartment building. But this looks really dim, and he sees a stairway in the corner going up. Goes over to the stairway, but he's looking for his clothes. No clothes. Doesn't know what's going on, so he takes the bedspread off, wraps it around him, goes up the stairs, opens the door, and steps into a kitchen where there's a woman cooking who turns around and screams, "Who are you?" And he assumed this was John's mother who's returned, you see. So he said, well, I spent the night, John asked me to spend the night. And she said, John who? And he tells the name. And she said, well, this isn't John's house. She said, John is a friend of my son, but he doesn't live here. Whereupon the son, Jim, the one who had gotten drunk the night before, came down the stairs into the kitchen and takes one look at Stephen and says, wrapped up in his bedspread, and said, how'd you get here? Now, they'd never met before that night. He'd never been to this house before. And how did you get here? How'd you get in? And his mother was saying, you know, the doors were locked. He said, I don't know. Where are your clothes? I don't know. So they called John's house, and he said, oh, his clothes are all here. So John took the clothes, brought them over to this house. The house was 3 miles away. It was March. It was very cold. And they decided he was the magic, absent-minded streaker who was able to forget the whole thing and to find a house he'd never been in before. 3 miles away from the house that he'd started out in, but he'd never been there before that night. At any rate, what do you do with a story like that? Well, he just thought, I don't know, something. And people who are having abduction experiences have this wonderful ability to put something like that on a shelf and think, oh, it's a crazy thing. It's an impossible thing. It's not a crazy thing. It's impossible. So when I did hypnosis with this is what happened. He wakes up back at John's. He can't move. There's this tremendous light coming in the windows. And these figures come through the glass. He's taken right through the glass. Now, mind you, this is a residential street in Croydon. It's on the 3rd floor, right outside an apartment window. Again, could not have been seen. Otherwise, it would have been seen. He's taken in the craft, and as he's moved through the craft, he has to sit down. They make him sit down on a seat that comes out of the wall. And he describes the seat wonderfully. I said, could you see the legs? He said, doesn't have legs. He said, it's like the wall melted. You know, it came down and out and stuff. So he sits there. Then they take him, for some reason, they take him into another room a little bit later, very shortly after that. He's put on a table, and the usual kinds of things happen. And a sperm sample was taken. He was examined. I think there might have been a scoop mark. I don't remember, but various things. And then he's brought out, and he's asked to sit down on this seat again. And he's sitting there, and he wants to move, but he can't really move. He can't get up. And coming around this curving corridor are 2 aliens carrying or propping up the drunken Jim, whose knees are wobbling, a drunken 16-year-old or whatever. And under hypnosis, Stephen said, he looks awful. He looks terrible. He said, I don't know what happened to him. He said, there's something all over his shirt. He said, I think he threw up on his David Bowie T-shirt. So he wants to help him. So the aliens have him stand up, and 4 of them, the 2 humans and the 2 aliens, go down an opening in the craft, and they're taken into a bedroom, which is his friend Jim's bedroom, his new friend. And the aliens stand there and more or less hand the drunken Jim to him. And he walks him over to the bed, and he takes his clothes off and pulls his shirt off, puts him in bed, and in a very touching little detail, he looks around for a wastebasket to put next to the bed in case he's sick again during the night. Then the aliens take him and float him down some stairs to this basement room and put him to bed, and that's where he woke up. And what's amazing about this, of course, is it suggests the aliens have never handled a drunk before, especially a drunken 16-year-old, and that can hardly be. But at any rate, it showed some kind of concern that they wanted this other human, and presumably both were abductees long before this, but they wanted a human to take care of this other sick, strange human, so they brought him into it and just decided to leave him there rather than taking him back where they had picked him up from. Just one final thing about this man, Stephen. What led him to look into the whole phenomenon, which is a very touching story, and his wife was there when he was telling me about it, but he had gone through all these experiences, and he said this was about 2 or 3 years ago, was the real crowning case for him. He goes to bed, they go to bed, and he wakes up, and he's standing in his pajamas in the backyard. And he thinks, oh, I must have been sleepwalking. And he turns around to the big sliding glass doors to open them, and they're locked. There's a kind of a little latch thing that prevents them from being moved. And he thinks, oh, I must have been sleepwalking, gone out the front door, and come around behind. So he goes around to the front door, and it's locked. And he thinks, well, it must have slammed behind me and locked me out. So he starts ringing the doorbell and throwing pebbles at his wife's window. And she comes down, and he's standing outside the door, and he's calling to her through the door, and he hears her slide the deadbolt aside to unlock the door. And he said, at that moment, I realized I didn't go through that door either. And the whole thing hit him with full force. Something else was responsible for his finding himself in the backyard. And it was too much for him. Excuse me. So what happened is she opens the door and he burst into tears. And she did not know what was the matter. Because why is he outside? What's happened? And he was crying and really upset because obviously what this was doing was psychologically, it was linking together, boom, 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 all these other strange things, waking up naked in the wrong house and everything else. And at that point, he had that sort of confirmation anxiety that, oh my God, something real is going on. And he said, that it's very touching, that his wife started crying. And she was extremely upset because she hadn't seen him like that. And he had to take her upstairs, and he had to stop crying and get her in bed and try to calm her down. And ultimately, they contacted me when I was speaking in England at a conference, and I've seen him several times since. And he has gotten to be friendly via email with both Debbie Jordan from my book Intruders, and especially Linda Cortila, who he's met in New York City. And he's coming back to New York in May. He loves New York with his wife, and he's a very fine man. He's coming back in May, and he's going to do a seminar for us at IF, along with Debbie Jordan, who's going to be in town too. He's going to meet her for the first time, so we're going to have to put the two of them on. But anyway, it's a fascinating story. But again, this could not have happened if it was seeable. I mean, nobody saw this big thing right up against a building in a residential area. Even if it was only there for, let's say, a minute, nobody seemed to have seen it. And these things happen so frequently that they simply have to be unseeable. Okay, question?
Yes, have you encountered experiencers who, through repeated abductions, have formed relationships of love and or sexual, where then they are shown the children, and this goes on for a long period of time?
Right, the idea of them seeing, abductees forming a relationship with an alien, or more likely, this kind of transgenic being that has human characteristics, which even can fall into a love relationship, and almost everything has happened in that one can imagine. I mean, those kinds of cases have occurred. There are cases where there's and I go into some of them in the book, where there's this strange alternation on the part of the half-alien being between being brutal and selfish and aggressive and being very loving. And all the kinds of mixed feelings result that, often result in the case of a battered wife who loves her husband. He's a wonderful man. He just has a terrible temper. And that's how my jaw was broken. This weird not being able to put it in any one final place. That's one of the things about the entire phenomenon. It is so complex emotionally that it's very, very difficult for people going through it, because as a friend of mine once said, he's a pretty strong guy, he said, if I felt they were enemies and I could, I could take a swing at one of them, get out of here, but he said they don't seem to be enemies. They look small and weak, and I can't do anything anyway. So he couldn't hate them. At the same time, he's extremely upset with what's going on. And of course, as I say over and over again, I've never seen any suggestion that the UFO occupants are malevolent. You know, that's what we get in movies. You know, the Independence Day, they blow up everything and they come down to conquer and steal away our supermarkets and whatever it is. And we don't see that at all. On the other hand, many people want to see this as a very benevolent thing. I don't see that either. The neutrality of what they do is very, very hard for people to accept who are having experiences. They would almost rather see it as good guys or bad guys or something and put it in some final place because they have more resolution when they can view it that way. But seeing it this way, and it's all of its emotional ambiguity, is extremely difficult. And I've had people who, well, as one example, of course, there's so much alien manipulation in this, but in one case, I was working with a woman, and she's on the table, and she's feeling an enormous amount of fear, and she's feeling pain, real pain, which very often doesn't happen. But she's feeling real pain, and she's feeling anger. She can't move, and so these emotions are really coming up, and the doctor type comes over and puts his hand on her forehead and stares into her eyes, and she said she feels a wave of love for this man that is beyond belief. She said, I would sacrifice my children's life for this man. That's the kind of love I feel. And just, it's instantaneous. No more anger, no more pain, everything. He walks away, pain starts coming back. She starts to get angry again. She starts, what is this? He comes back, the hand down, he's staring. She loves this man again, as if, now to bounce between those poles emotionally in any kind of a relationship doesn't do you any good psychologically. I mean, you're bound to be straddling a lot of aspects of yourself and not knowing where to come down. And I think that this is one of the basic characteristics of the phenomenon that's in a way emotionally damaging to people because they can't really easily put it in a given place. Yeah. Another question in the back?
Yeah, is there for example, we have UFO sightings that are supposedly frequent in various parts of the country. Do they have, or are there, from your observation, areas of the country where abductions seem to happen more frequently than others? And the other part of this question is there something you find that they all have in common?
Yeah. Well, the first thing about, do the people who experience abductions have something in common? What they do have in common is a set of reactions to the experiences. This is kind of a chicken and the egg thing. The uneasiness that many abductees have, when we did psychological testing years ago, they all showed three deficits: low self-esteem, a sense of separation from their physicality and their sexuality and so on, as if they don't really own their bodies. And the third thing is a lot of issues of trust, relationship issues. Now, we think all of those are probably due to what they've gone through as abductees. So the similarities would lie in sort of the after effects. I would imagine that, for instance, thinking of the recent unpleasantness in the Roman Catholic Church, that survivors of incest, of sexual abuse at the hand of the clergy, those people would probably share a great deal in terms of their after effects and reactions. And yet, initially, they may in personality types be very, very different, one from another. I have seen no similarity amongst abductees that would be, you know, genetic or whatever. We don't really know why people are picked, except this across the bloodline situation that occurs. Now, whether or not there are hot spots, so-called, where there are more abductions going on, that's really almost impossible to say because you don't know what's going on in any given place. It's just what you hear about. And it's because we have in the United States a reporting system like the Opus Group and many of you in MUFON and ourselves in IF and so forth. There are places where you can report these experiences and be listened to and treated sympathetically. So we hear about more cases than if none of us existed doing this kind of work. And other places in the world do not have that kind of situation, and therefore we don't know what's going on. And so when I was in England giving a talk, somebody was skeptical, saying, oh, this is just an American phenomenon. It's just a crazy thing. You Americans, especially you Americans on the West Coast around San Francisco. But, you know, the old bunch of flakes in your country and all this and that, publicity. And I said, no, it's because we have a place to report it. There's material that people can read. There are things on television, tapes, and so forth. They can get a sense of what's going on and understand that their life is connected with these experiences, and they can allow those experiences to be explored and bring them up. And I said, if you don't have any of that, there's no accessibility to the material, and there's nobody to help you or report to, then you're not going to hear about it. And he said, nonsense. It's only in the United States. So I gave a second talk, and I titled it, "There is no child abuse in Iran." And I said, is there anybody in this room who can name one case of child abuse in Iran? It must only happen in Great Britain, France, United States, etc. So I don't know about the hotspot situation. I've always felt that if there was a town somewhere, Montana or whatever, and there's never been a UFO sighting reported or never anything, and it's accepted as a place where nothing's ever happened, and one of us here who talks about this subject would go to that town, befriend the local disc jockey or something as a call-in program, get an article in the local newspaper about the phenomenon, you would find all kinds of cases would suddenly bubble up. So the place where there's nothing happening, once there's an outlet, you're going to find more. So it's really hard to answer that. Yeah. Question? Oh,
Have you,
of all the cases that you've looked at, this may be a crazy question, but do you consider the quality of the aliens to be the same in all the cases? In their work, I'm talking about the kind of work they perform.
Well, certainly the quality of the aliens, the quality of their work and so forth, it's much more similar than dissimilar. Now, there are cases where they make really stupid mistakes. One of my favorites is this woman I was working with who was wearing her new Victoria's Secret nightgown when she went to bed, and she woke up with some funny memories, and she was wearing this big, bulky man's green T-shirt, which always made us wonder how he woke up, you see. But the point is, this thing of getting the wrong clothes on the wrong person. Maybe some group is sloppier than another or whatever, who knows. But I think in general, the similarities, and these similarities, I don't care whether it's my case or David Jacobs' case or John Mack's or John Carpenter, we're all getting the same data, essentially. Some of us have different interpretations of what this might mean for the future. But the point is that I don't see many differences. That's one of the things about it. It's so regular, it's like they know exactly what to do. Yeah, question?
well, as you were talking about the swapping garments, if you refer to it as swapping, yes. What is the range of emotions that these aliens seem to express? You mentioned earlier, and I'm thinking the garment thing, a sense of humor. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure about a sense of humor. That's something that it's kind of hard to. It's funny to us, but maybe not to them. If somebody does a pratfall and trips and falls, it's a lot funnier to us than it is to him. So I don't know what the aliens, how they react to this. But the range of emotions is, and David Jacobs has looked at this very closely and in a very analytical way. It's interesting. His point is that they can register surprise, like something is unexpected. They can register not exactly anger, but that they're irked a little bit. There doesn't seem to be strong emotions in our range. Now, some of these emotions of love and connection might be just purely manipulative. I mean, we don't know that they really do love us, when people feel that kind of thing. I mean, who knows? But the point is that they don't seem to express it the way we would. So I think their range of emotion is very narrow, and I think that's one of the things that really interests them about us. You see, one of the things that is reassuring is that, if this were some sort of malevolent thing and they're going to swoop down and steal our computers and our atomic weapons and so forth, there's nothing of that. They seem interested in how we feel about each other, how we feel about our children, how we feel, in a sense, in relationships about sexuality and so forth. They don't seem to be interested in the things that we think of as outside basic human nature. And the fact that they're interested in what's really best about us, I think, is really a very good sign. Yeah, question?
I have a guest that came up from Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
She flew up here. And the question she asked me to ask you, in Spanish, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Are any of your books or materials in Spanish?
Intruders has been translated into Spanish, Intrusos. And I'm trying to think. That's the only book that I can think of. No, well, there might be another one. Several of them have been translated into Portuguese, which doesn't help, largely because of Brazil, which has a big interest. So actually, there are many languages, Polish, Swedish, Danish, German, Italian, etc., and Japanese and Chinese. But for some reason, your friend, you can ask her a question of me. Does she know any Spanish publishers that would love to do this for me, to publish a translation? Because I would like the material, of course, to be widely distributed. Yeah, we have what?
Hold on one second.
Yeah.
We're going to change the tape. One more
Okay.
time here.
So publishes, one of the basic situations of that case. We have another witness who did see them floating in the air, and an excellent witness. I would like to write a new 3 chapters to end the book, to bring it up to date. Most important is the reaction of the Roman Catholic Church. Through a long series of steps I can't even go into, but Linda Cortilla met with Cardinal O'Connor in New York, who was the leading Roman Catholic prelate in the United States. He was extremely interested in her, apparently knew everything about the case, and it's certain that from a letter that I had received from Richard, one of the agents, that he had spoken with Cardinal O'Connor, and presumably the third man had spoken to Cardinal O'Connor, was fully informed of what happened, and Cardinal O'Connor was very close to the Pope, and the Pope began making statements to the effect that there was no doubt that extraterrestrial life exists, and that when it appears and we make contact or whatever, or see it or something, it will have God's fingerprints, God's handprints on it. As if the Pope is almost preparing the Roman Catholic laity to accept the idea that this exists. And what happened since then, which is fascinating, is the Roman Catholic Church purchased a state-of-the-art observatory in Arizona and updated it, spent something like $8 million on it, and they're involved in some astronomical research, some projects in conjunction with NASA. Now, there are other things too, but what the suggestion is the Roman Catholic clergy, more than any other area, seems to be responding to the reality of that event. And there is more to it that I'm not privileged to be able to talk about right now. But it's extraordinarily important. One thing about the Roman Catholic Church that I think is very interesting here is Linda Cortilla's parents, her mother, used to call the local priest when she was a little girl, and Linda was, to come and bless the house with holy water and so forth, because there were demons coming through the walls at night that they saw them from time to time. Now, what's interesting about this, and obviously there's a strong chance that Linda's family have had experiences. What's interesting about this is that the Roman Catholic Church is really the only large religious body which has almost day-to-day contact with the parishioners through confession, and which we don't have in the Protestant faith and Judaism and so forth. The connection means that lots of people are going to be telling their priests, something came through the wall last night, or I saw something at the foot of my bed, or they're going to be telling something, and that information is going to work its way up to the hierarchy, and probably has for decades and decades. So I think that I can tell you that Cardinal O'Connor was arranging a trip for Linda Cortilla to go to Rome to meet the Pope. It never happened for a lot of reasons, partly her fear. But at any rate, there was the church is with open arms, as you just said, relating to this subject. So it's not all a backward thing. But at any rate, I want to thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, right.
Actually, we got one more question, bud. Can we just get you for one more second here?
Okay.
One more question. This guy's been waiting very patiently.
Thank you.
What's the question?
Yeah, in regards to your subjects that you put under hypnosis, is there any pre-existing psychiatric history at all with them?
Well, there certainly is with some. I mean, that's one of the things that you have to look into. And
do you have access to that? And
no, I don't have access. I'm not a therapist. But the point is that we have, since this is a cross-section, and since these people are very often suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, I'll just tell you one quick example. A man came to me, had gone through some very, very frightening experiences. He wasn't sure what they were, but it's a missing time thing, and his brother and the two wives were involved daytime, huge period of missing time, and so forth. And he'd been in therapy for years because of post-traumatic stress disorder. Could not sleep, flashbacks, and finally he contacted me, and we did a hypnotic regression with this incident that happened near Palm Springs, the desert. And he was so terrified. I mean, it's hard to believe. He was so terrified that, more so than almost anybody I've ever worked with, it took me a half an hour, to keep him from screaming and crying. At any rate, I told him to go back to his therapist and tell the therapist what he'd remembered. I wanted him to get help right away. He called me later, and I said, "Did you talk to your therapist?" He said, "Yes." And this therapist was an expert in PTSD because he worked with a lot of Vietnam vets and so forth. And I said, "Well, I'm glad you did. What did your therapist say?" And he said, "My therapist believed me and said this explains what happened to you. We've been looking for the trauma behind the PTSD for years." And I said, "Oh, that's terrific." He said, "No, it isn't." He said, "I severed my relationship," and he said, "I'm never going to see him again." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "It's because I wanted him to tell me that this is a mental condition of some sort that can be healed. I did not want him to believe it."
Thank you, Bud.
Thank you. Thank you.
Again, if you're interested, we have 2 more books.